Hello, I'm Tony Svejcar with the Agricultural Research Service, and I'm here to present an Eastern Oregon Ag Minute. A number of us have used Ag Minutes to talk about the history of ag research in this area. I thought it might be useful to provide some background about the modern settlement of this part of the country. Most of my focus will be on the late 1800s up to about World War II. I should probably start by saying a little bit about the Homestead Act. The original Homestead Act was signed in 1862 by President Lincoln and allowed settlers to acquire 160 acres of land if they met certain stipulations. As we all know, making a living from 160 acres in this part of the world is no small chore. It may have been a little easier 120 years ago, but not much. In fact, when Major John Wesley Powell evaluated this region in the late 1800s, he reported back to Congress that a farm unit should be not less than 2,560 acres, should have irrigatable lands, and small streams. There was the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which allowed 320 acres, and then the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916, which allowed 640 acres. But by that time, much of the good land had already been claimed. Many people may be surprised to learn that homesteading did not officially end until enactment of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976. And in Alaska, homesteading continued up until 1986. The Homestead Act had huge implications for the way this part of the country was settled and the current relationships between public and private land. As I mentioned yesterday, the Homestead Act had huge implications for land ownership patterns in this part of the country. In most states east of the Rockies, the bulk of the land was homesteaded and went into private ownership. Those states are 90% or more privately owned, whereas in the western U.S., only about half the land is privately owned. The balance is primarily owned by the federal government. Yesterday I mentioned that from 1862 to 1909, the Homestead Act allowed for claims on only 160 acres, although there were some creative ways to acquire more than that. In our part of the country, 160 acres simply was not enough to support a family farm. So people largely homesteaded around water and grazed livestock on the adjoining unclaimed federal land. The problem was that nobody really had any rights to the land, and therefore whoever got there first used the forage. This was the classic tragedy of the commons, where everybody uses a resource but nobody really has responsibility. The federal government never intended to be a big landowner and really had no system in place to manage land on this kind of a scale. Remember, the Homestead Act had the intended effect east of the Rockies, and at that time, where did nearly all of the folks in Congress call home? This week I've been talking about the Homestead Act and how homesteading influenced land ownership and resource management. I should actually rephrase that. There really was no resource management on the unclaimed federal lands until the 1930s. There was a report by David Griffiths from USDA in 1902 which described forage conditions in northern Nevada and southern Oregon. He traveled to the Steens and with some local help estimated that there were between 180 and 190,000 sheep that used the Steens for summer pasture. There were also plenty of cattle and horses, but he didn't have estimates of numbers for those livestock species. Griffith's general conclusion was that our rangeland was producing about one-third of its potential forage. Lack of rangeland management caused problems other than loss of forage production. There were cases in Utah where flooding caused portions of hillsides to flow into towns burying homes and other structures. At the time, newspaper accounts blamed heavy grazing and removal of vegetation as a factor. The federal government did eventually acknowledge that something needed to be done, and in 1934 the Taylor Grazing Act was passed. Indirectly, passage of this act allowed the creation of the experimental range west of Riley. The intent of the act was to bring some order to the chaos created by the Homestead Acts. The Taylor Grazing Act created grazing districts for the unclaimed federal land that was eligible under the Homestead Acts. Keep in mind that this did not include the national forest lands, which were administered by the U.S. Forest Service. The grazing districts were set up to allocate grazing use on about 80 million acres of rangeland. In the northern areas, where severe winters required the feeding of hay, grazing allocations were made on the basis of ownership of private land which could provide a winter feed. The Taylor Grazing Act also created the U.S. Grazing Service, which was to administer the grazing permits once the allocations were made. And it was the U.S. Grazing Service that allocated 16,000 acres that are now the Great Basin Experimental Range. The need for rangeland research was recognized by the Oregon legislature, which agreed to assist in creating a range and livestock experiment station. As we have mentioned in other Ag Minutes, the experimental range was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during 1935 to 1941. Administration of the experimental range changed hands several times during the early years. From 1935 to mid-1945, the Grazing Service had jurisdiction. Then for 2 months, it was Oregon State University. For another 2 to 3 months, it was the Forest Service Research. And then from 1946 to mid-1956, it was the BLM. From July 1, 1956 to present, the Agricultural Research Service has had jurisdiction. So after a fairly rough start, there has been consistent ownership for 50-plus years. The advantage of having an experimental range in the area is that we can provide the long-term information critical for both public and private land managers. There are surprisingly few long-term research facilities in the Great Basin, and without the foresight of a few people back in the